For most of the 20th century, the North Carolina public school system was what was called a dual system. It was, in other words, racially segregated by law. School districts operated two sets of school systems, one for white children and one for African American children. In some places in North Carolina, like Robertson County, there were actually three systems, one for whites, one for blacks, and one for Native Americans. North Carolina even had a separate college for Native American students in Pembroke, North Carolina. These school systems were supposed to be separate but equal, to use the legal language from the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. And in fact, in almost no instances was it true that the school systems were equal, in North Carolina or elsewhere. Going back to the founding of the state's modern school system in the early 1900s, state superintendents advised local superintendents on how they could actually make sure that more money went to white children. Despite white control of the state system, African American educators sought ways of increasing black autonomy over the curriculum. And during the 1930s through the 1950s, the NAACP fought for equalization of school funding, including the building up of higher education institutions like the North Carolina College for Negroes in Durham, which later went on to become North Carolina Central. Nevertheless, the economic prospects for white and black students of North Carolina public schools remained woefully unequal. Now, what upended this segregated school system? Perhaps you think of desegregation happening in the 1950s, right after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case came down in 1954. It is certainly true that this decision fundamentally altered the possibilities for ending Jim Crow segregation, and Brown versus Board would eventually have ramifications for schools far beyond the South. But by 1964, a decade after Brown v. Board, this is the percentage of African American students attending school with white children in North Carolina. 1%. So, the federal courts alone did not desegregate schools. What else had to happen? Federal legislation was important. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the Department of Justice the capacity to bring lawsuits against school districts that weren't complying, which you might think of as a stick. Legislation also gave the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare the ability to withhold money from schools that weren't desegregated, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 provided a big pot of money from the federal government for the first time. So there's your carrot. Here, segregated school districts, you can have this money if you submit desegregation plans. And if you don't, the federal government's going to sue you. So, you had the system in place. But still, it took several years of ratcheting up the requirements of what counted as desegregation, and several more Supreme Court cases before there was enough pressure on school systems to eliminate single-race schools. It's really not until 1970 that school systems across the South are moving towards something close to full integration. Now, the story is similar in states across the South, but the particulars do vary considerably by place and time. In many states, such as Virginia and Alabama and Mississippi, you had white massive resistance efforts against desegregation in the immediate wake of Brown v. Board. You might be familiar with the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, who eventually had to have an Army division escort them into high school in 1957. Or you might think of Alabama Governor George Wallace and his stand at the schoolhouse door. In North Carolina, the process was similarly contentious, but it created fewer big nationally televised scenes as occurred in most other southern states. But that didn't mean that white leadership in North Carolina was kind and accommodating to eliminating segregation. In the 1950s, state leaders concocted what became known as the Pearsall Plan to slow school desegregation. That plan reduced the state's authority in public education, putting the onus on localities, which meant that the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund had to go after every school system with separate lawsuits, with separate plaintiffs, in order to force desegregation, rather than simply suing the state. Some districts, particularly urban ones, opted for what became known as token desegregation. This was the case initially in Greensboro and Winston-Salem and Charlotte, where local school boards grudgingly permitted a handful of African-American children to attend, though they went out of their way to make sure that it was a difficult process. By the mid-1950s, most districts in North Carolina had adopted freedom of choice plans, which meant that parents could petition the school board to attend a particular school. But there was no effort made to redistrict around, say, geography rather than race. But these white-run school districts eventually succumbed to local pressure from African-American activists and, after 1964, federal pressure. Those carrots of federal money, those sticks of the Department of Justice and the courts. The numbers show how quickly things began to change. In 1965, 5% of black students in North Carolina attended school with whites. By 1969, it was 28%. By 1971, it had jumped up to 50%, and finally, in 1973, 99.5% of North Carolina black students attended desegregated schools. By the mid-1970s, North Carolina had the South's and the nation's most integrated public schools. Now, it's easy to tell that story as a triumph, but it also had considerable costs, especially for African Americans. Sometimes parents of these pioneering, typically very bright black students who desegregated white schools thought that their children would get a better education with better textbooks and instructional opportunities. But most of these parents also knew that it was a really tough call, that their children might have to sacrifice a comfortable education at an all-black school where they would rule the roost in exchange for enduring constant taunts and cold shoulders in order to make this significant step towards eliminating racial segregation. Many of the pioneers of this movement have written memoirs of their experiences, and many more have been interviewed for oral history projects. In September 1957, 15-year-old Dorothy Counts was the first African American to attend a white school in Charlotte. Photos spread across the country of her entering the school building with 400 or so agitators and onlookers taunting her. At lunch, boys walked by putting trash on her plate. She was pushed and shoved in the halls, and two white girls who had befriended her one day shunned her the next, themselves pressured by ostracism if they didn't turn their backs on Dorothy. Finally, facing physical threats, Dorothy and her father, a professor of philosophy, decided that she would withdraw rather than continue to endure such torments. Now, another example is the case of Sheila Florence. She was one of the first black students to integrate Chapel Hill, which was considered a very liberal place in North Carolina. Nevertheless, when she started junior high in 1962, she was called racial slurs and shunned and forced to sit alone as well at lunchtime. We could also listen to the story of Fran Jackson, who was a black student who attended a formerly all-white high school in Chapel Hill in the 1960s. When Chapel Hill High merged with Lincoln, which had been the black school in the Chapel Hill district, almost all the history of Lincoln was erased. The successful track coach was demoted to assistant, the mascot remained that of Chapel Hill rather than Lincoln, and the archives and sports trophies from Lincoln were thrown in a dumpster. Now, a common thread in a lot of these stories is what many observers have noted about the way Southern school integration worked. It was a one-way process. In other words, African Americans had to pay the higher price in terms of the distances that they were bused or the former schools that were closed down that used to belong to African Americans. Numerous black teachers and principals with decades of experience were fired or forced into subordinate positions in integrated schools. This loss of cherished community institutions led many African Americans in some communities to resist white-controlled integration. Now, David Ciesielski tells one such story in this book, which details how in Hyde County, North Carolina, black students launched a boycott for an entire school year from 1968 to 1969, rather than agreeing to such a one-sided process, ultimately keeping the former all-black school from closing. One of the most important Supreme Court cases, and in many respects, the one that took school desegregation as far as it has ever come in American history, was a case about the Charlotte school system. The case was called Swan v. Mecklenburg County. There, a federal judge ordered that the school system needed not just to desegregate neighborhood schools, but to bus students to create racial balance in all of the schools in order to eliminate historical apartheid. And the Supreme Court backed him up. In a unanimous decision handed down in 1971, the court affirmed the busing plan for the Charlotte system. Such busing remedies were controversial then and became increasingly so over the course of the 1970s, particularly as civil rights leaders and federal agencies pushed northern cities to desegregate. Back to Charlotte, many parents were upset at first, and when the busing plan was first put into effect in 1970, bomb threats roiled the city. An arsonist burned the office of Julius Chambers, who was the lead attorney arguing for busing in Charlotte, and police helped break up fights between white and black students at the city's high schools, fights that were often termed race riots. Still, despite the controversies over the Charlotte plan, the Charlotte schools stuck with it, even after the federal judge closed the matter in 1975. About a decade later, then President Ronald Reagan visited the city while seeking re-election. He delivered a stump speech denouncing busing for making innocent children into pawns in a social experiment that nobody wants. Reagan was expecting cheers for this line, but instead he got an awkward silence, even though he was speaking to fellow Republicans. Integration through busing had become part of the fabric of the Charlotte community. The decision about Charlotte and Swan versus Mecklenburg represented the high watermark for the Supreme Court support for integration. In 1974, the court, which had been remade by Nixon appointees, ruled against interdistrict busing in the case Milligan versus Bradley. Integration, in other words, would have to stop at the district line, and it was a ruling that protected most American suburban kids from having to integrate with city kids. In North Carolina, these district lines continued to make integration difficult, even after the end of all white or all black or all Indian schools. District lines often hardened into racial lines, as many parents decided where to live in the city or the suburb based on the demographics of the school district. Many places, like Rocky Mount or Goldsboro or Durham, would undergo drawn-out desegregation debates that culminated in city-county school mergers in the 1980s or 1990s. Magnet school programs for the arts or sciences became another popular strategy for trying to incentivize integration. Despite all this, though, some highly segregated city and county districts never merged, as in Halifax County, where I taught high school for several years. Even in Charlotte, the system of maintaining integrated schools did not last. In the next video, we'll take up how and why schools have resegregated since the high watermark of the 1980s.